Peter is a major voice in the protection of orcas. He has been for over a decade. He has alerted us, informed us, done the research, has the credibility, is so well known, and has done so much for the orcas and given us ammunition and things we can say in the form of information that we can give to people, and in a whole range of bioaccumulative persistent pollutants. So with that, I would like to, and I'm very honored and pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Ross.
Thanks Howard and Susan for hosting today and welcoming me down. Living in Victoria, it's always a pleasure to come across the pond and meet new faces. Lots of new faces in the room today. As Howard mentioned, I'm a toxicologist. I'm interested in marine pollution. That's what we study. We use some pretty exceptional study animals, killer whales. I don't need to introduce them, but and I'm sure you've heard much about many of the issues that they face, whether it's through the media or through meetings such as this. We of course have heard today primarily about the southern resident killer whales. These are Chinook addicts. They're transboundary animals plying the waters of the Sewage Sea, and they're listed as endangered both here in the US, and they're listed as endangered in Canada under the Species at Risk Act. And there's been lots of science to substantiate the threats, the three major threats that they face, and lots of concern expressed by numerous parties. We've heard a little bit about transients. These are the marine mammal eaters, and I'll tell you why this is interesting from a pollution perspective in a few minutes. But again, they don't need much of an introduction to you folks. We're pretty lucky around here, as you all know, to run into some species which you won't find in other parts of the world, and they're found in pretty good abundance. They are pretty wonderful, whether you're a kayaker or a whale watcher, or you live on Whidbey Island or in the San Juan Gulf Islands here. And for someone like me, when I look at a marine mammal, I look at really an indicator species that can tell me something about what's going on in the ocean. And this one on the left is one of my favorite critters. Salmon fishermen often berate harbor seals for stealing their fish, but I like to look at harbor seals as one of the most rewarding and exceptional voices in the ocean. They're local indicators of environmental pollution because they don't migrate, but they sit atop the food web, so they provide me with an integrated signal of local environmental quality. And as you all know, killer whales, a little bit of a different story because they move far and wide, as do their prey. So harbor seal, a really good study animal, and they're not actually as abundant as some people would imagine. About 17,000 on the Washington State side and about 110,000 on the Canadian side. And they're widely distributed, most widely distributed pinniped in the northern hemisphere actually, and as I say, a useful study animal. But around here, of course, the world revolves around salmon, and we've heard about salmon. We like to consume salmon. Salmon is a cornerstone of a lot of ecosystems around the coast, whether they're marine, estuarine, or even indeed fresh water. And they deliver nutrients into the coastal rainforest around here, and of course they feed coastal grizzly bears. In fact, grizzly bears in British Columbia, if they do have access to salmon, will have on average one more cub than their more omnivorous interior counterparts. So salmon and the gorging on salmon in the fall season provides a wonderful supply of important nutrition to grizzly bears, and we actually call them maritime mammals. They're close to marine mammals. So ecologically, to me, they're telling me something about the ocean again, and in fact, I'll mention why grizzly bears are a little bit interesting from a pollution perspective in a minute. But let's not forget that we're not talking simply about nice, fuzzy, cuddly, beautiful animals that we tend to get red in the face talking about when we're talking to people that may not understand or appreciate that. But we are talking about money here. We're talking about ecotourism, which is probably worth $2 to $2.5 billion a year between BC and Washington. This is sustainable. This is something that needs protection. So that's a renewable sector that we'd like to see supported, of course. And we're talking about food. We're talking about wanting to see clean and abundant seafoods. Of course, that is worth something commercially. It's worth a couple of $2 billion in terms of recreational opportunities, and of course, it's worth a great deal to coastal Aboriginal communities in BC and Washington, and indeed around the entire continent. And in fact, some of the work that we've been doing in British Columbia has really underscored this. These are Canadian numbers, but on the far left, the average Canadian consumes 4.5 kilograms of seafood per year. Fairly similar in the States, so let's talk 10 to 12 pounds of seafood per year, the average American or Canadian. If you get into the Aboriginal communities, the middle two bars, 13 to 14 times as much on Vancouver Island as that. In other words, up to 60 kilograms per year or 140 pounds per year of seafood. And these are Aboriginal consumers that have ready access to supermarket foods. Okay, so even in a modern economy, Aboriginal communities have access and value that access to seafood. So I think it's important for us to remember this because often the coastal peoples are not included or incorporated into traditional risk assessments, and these statistics betray, or the average statistics betray what might actually be a very, very different story for coastal people. So these are all reasons, and I think very strong economic and cultural reasons to protect, and that means both against sort of the detrimental effects of pollution on seafood, in other words, reducing the quantity of say, salmon or other biota, but also pollutants that might get into that seafood and might not harm that item, but it might be harmful to human or wildlife consumers of that seafood. So really what we're talking around here, talking about around these parts is no secret to anybody in this room. But there is an interconnectedness between the ocean and land, and we're talking about not only nutrition and food and energy, but we're also talking about some of the nasty things that I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes. It's amazing to me that only 50 years ago we still had industrial scale whaling in these parts. And if you look back at the numbers of great whales that were decimated in the northeastern Pacific between the 1800s and the mid-1900s, it's pretty astounding. And in fact, as these great whale populations faced these heavy conservation pressures, we saw depletion of many of the great whales. In fact, some of those are having an awful lot of trouble recovering because of their longevity and their low reproductive capacity. So fin whales, sei whales, blue whales, humpback whales, etc. Some good news, of course, as you've heard with gray whales and some other species, but it takes a long time to recover a species that has such a long life and large habitat needs and low reproductive output. And that's a challenge to conservationists. And what have we learned from that? Well, we've certainly learned a lot about biology, ecology, and conservation over the last number of decades. But to put this in another perspective, we've got the pinpointed points on this map of British Columbia between Vancouver Island and the Queen Charlotte Islands, Haida Gwaii, of the whale kills, the historical cumulative great whale kills, toothed and baleen. And what's interesting here is that these data points where a whale died is also giving us the ability to understand something about its historical habitat use. And this is very important when you're starting to define critical habitat or habitat and where they were feeding and what might be important in terms of its habitat needs. So these old whaling records are actually becoming very, very important from a species at risk or endangered species perspective as we seek to define the habitats that we have to protect to allow the recovery of endangered species. But another thing here, I just added a silhouette to the central coast of British Columbia, right up into southeastern Alaska. This is an outline of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And should there be a major oil spill similar to the EVOS event in 1989, it would pretty much cover the entire coastline of British Columbia. So pretty astounding. And then when you look at the 5,000 or 10,000 points, the red and white dots here where whales were killed, you can see where their habitat has historically been very, very important to them. You could see that we can have a real disaster on our hands. And we heard a little bit about oil just prior, and here just a little bit more. So in British Columbia, two major topics of discussion I'm sure you've heard of. One is the Northern Gateway project. That's a pipeline proposal to go into Kitimat in northern British Columbia. It's indicated on the map here. And that's a pipeline from tar sands to Kitimat that would deliver diluted bitumen and allow up to 250 or 300 super tankers to exit from Kitimat and head over to Asia and or down to California to export this raw heavy oil. That's a major topic of debate right now in Canada. The other one is the Kinder Morgan pipeline that already exists. It goes into Burrard Inlet, which is Vancouver, the Port of Vancouver. This is a pre-existing pipeline, Kinder Morgan pipeline, that they wish to double or triple in terms of capacity. And this may lead to another 250 or 300 super tankers coming through Harrow Strait here on its way to Asia or down south to California. So the great whale story, 1850s, 1860s, when industrial oil was discovered and developed in eastern North America, that was sort of the beginning of the end of the whaling, the industrial whaling industry, but the beginning of a new era which brought us tremendous benefits in terms of economic advances, but at the same time we continue to incur tremendous risks as a result of that oil and the transport of that oil, the exploration of that oil, the use of that oil, and the spill of that oil. And I don't need to describe the threats, the visible and acute threats that oil, in particular heavy oils, present to wildlife, very, very visible. With Exxon Valdez, we continue to see lingering after effects, long-term effects, chronic effects. Oil simply does not degrade very, very quickly when it is protected or sheltered by rocks or boulders, or is it buried in sediments. So I think we're learning a lot about the longevity and the persistent risks associated with oil, and I won't belabor them. But we have here in the North Pacific a lot of other threats to marine mammals and to wildlife. Visible threats. Many of you perhaps participate in shoreline cleanups, and or you simply enjoy walking along a beach and you'll run into litter, all sorts of types of litter, mainly the items that float, and those items that float may be coming from your neighbor's yard and an adjacent property, a fishing vessel. It may be coming from disposal of fishing line or fishing gear that is used or worn or in disrepair, or it might be coming over from Asia. And we're seeing more and more impacts. Albatross in the mid-Pacific, sea turtles, ghost nets entangling fish, marine mammals, seabirds, etc. This is a problem that is going nowhere soon. And in fact, the Fukushima reactor and the associated tsunami debris from Japan is already arriving on our coastline, and we're expecting many thousands of tons of items of all color and shape and size and manner to arrive on our shoreline over the next year and a half or so. So we really don't know what's out there. I think we're very ill-prepared for what's coming at us. And in addition to that structural pollutant associated with something that an animal might swallow or getting tangled up in, we may also face a number of containers with toxic materials coming over as well that will wash off land. And here is just an overview of the amounts of material that are coming our way. We're expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 74 tons per kilometer of coastline in British Columbia, so I would say that would probably be a pretty similar number along the outer coast of Washington State, it's a bit of an unknown right now, and we're ill prepared for it. When we're looking at the quality of the ocean, I think we can't forget that the climate is changing, and this is a major threat to the resident killer whales that rely on salmon, and salmon need cold, productive waters, whether those are cool streams, natal streams, or migratory rivers, or cool ocean surface waters that are productive and have enough nutrients to supply a productive food web. We know that salmon are under pressure. Climate change is a major one, and that is a direct threat and a very important threat to killer whales. And the ocean is also getting more acidic, such that our local waters are now, the shellfish growers are complaining about reproductive problems in shellfish because the pH of the ocean is decreasing because of the dissolution of carbon dioxide in the ocean, which produces carbonic acid. So climate change giving us a bit of will be giving us a bit of a run for money in the future, and it's something that I think we have to be very concerned about. I think everybody in this room probably is concerned about. And it's going to require, obviously, concerted global action, but at a sort of a more personal or regional level, we're going to have to figure out how we adapt to this, or how we can be good shepherds or stewards of our own backyards, because there are ways in which to reduce the impacts or threats associated with climate change that may allow us to help a little bit in the future. At the same time, we've also got to recognize that when we have this major threat that supersedes virtually everything else, in some ways it makes it more important to take actions on other threats where we have more ability to take action. And we'll talk a little bit about pollutants, because sometimes when you have 2 or 3 threats adding together, you get more than the sum of the parts in terms of the impact at the population level for many wildlife species. So taking actions on something that is tractable, feasible, and economical at a local scale may allow, for example, salmon runs to continue to succeed in the face of climate change, or killer whales to have just a little bit more in the way of health and happiness as they face difficult times. Many of you may not know that the term C word led to the term sewage, such that sewage was something that we before the 1850s really didn't send into the ocean. Sewage was something that we had a lot of concerns about in major cities where typhus and cholera were creating epidemics, and there were a lot of human health problems that were very clear and evident, and the solution to that was to close up the ditches, create intercepting sewers, and channel all of that human waste down into streams, rivers, lakes, and of course the ocean. And that solved a lot of the human health problems, allowed us to manage our waste just a little bit better, but as we hear regularly these days, we are concerned about sewage effluent, not only because of human nutrients and pathogens, but also the many thousands of pharmaceuticals, flame retardants, cleaning products, dental mercury, et cetera, that make their way into the ocean. And whether you have primary, secondary, tertiary, or no treatment, you still have to be concerned about the effluent that is either getting into the ocean, or the retained sludge that then has to be evaluated for toxicity and managed in that way. So the solution in the 1850s, the salvation for many in the poor areas of rural London, where the major intercepting sewer design began for modern day civilization in the West, to today, where we have some very good sewage treatment plants, but we have very poor appreciation for a lot of the chemicals in that sewage stream, and which ones we should be concerned about, whether they break down, whether they dissolve in water, or they dissolve in food webs and get taken up into marine mammals. So we've got our blinders on a little bit, but some progress as I speak now in terms of understanding, but much more to be done. And there are lots of these chemicals that we don't know a lot about are new age threats. Personal care products, some of them very estrogenic, plasticizers, nanoparticles you hear a lot about, some of our toothpaste, some of our cleaning products, beauty products, and even a lot of these antibacterial clothing items that runners wear have nanosilver and nanoparticles in them that we really don't understand where they go and what they do. But increasingly, regulators worried about our ability to understand these compounds and understand their threats to aquatic environments. Most of the chemicals I've been studying over the last 25 years in marine mammals have been related to those chemicals that we have largely banned, having learned from a number of disastrous mistakes in the past. And I would almost argue that most of the discoveries that I've worked on, or I have appreciated in terms of the work that I do, represent mistakes that our regulators have made. An environmental scientist, or someone that studies marine pollution, is someone that is really is really there uncovering mistakes or uncovering issues that regulators have failed to predict. Regulators in our respective capitals like to have very simple recipes for allowing new chemical products on the market. That's because industry doesn't want bureaucracy, they don't want red tape, they want to get a chemical on the market such that new chemicals enter the marketplace after very elementary property information have been delivered to the regulators. And in the past, some of the past mistakes we've learned about are dioxins. The upper left, pulp and paper mills in BC and Washington, as well as other parts of the world, relied on liquid chlorine for bleaching, so we could get that nice white paper. In the late 1980s, Greenpeace actually started taking sediment samples in British Columbia and discovered very high levels of dioxins and furans around pulp mills. And that led to the pulp and paper effluent regulations. Both Canada and the States have worked very, very quickly to get liquid chlorine out of that processing system. Now it's primarily chlorine dioxide gas that is used to bleach paper, such that was a discovery by environmental scientists that was based in good research and field research, discovered a mistake. Regulators responded quickly and worked with industry at the source control level to eliminate, to reduce the release of dioxins and furans in British Columbia by 95%. So that's very, very important when you look at Dungeness crab or other invertebrates that were being harvested commercially in the coastal waters in BC. There's still 3,000 acres of seabed that is closed in BC because of dioxin contamination. So these pollutants can present health risks to biota, health risks to humans consuming seafoods, but also economic risks to commercial fisheries. DDT, we all remember the eggshell thinning caused by DDT, which is an estrogenic chemical. It was used as an insecticide, very, very persistent. But in that case, it took some good chemists to just detect a mystery chemical, a mystery substance in wildlife samples, and then eventually was tracked down, was identified as DDT, and laboratory studies showed that DDT was causing eggshell thinning, leading to catastrophic reproductive loss in raptors and fish-eating birds around North America and Europe. And once that was discovered, DDT was banned, and things have improved dramatically. I work a lot on PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. These are they're no longer used. They're banned in the mid-1970s in both Canada and the States. PCBs were used in electric transformers and heavy industry, very heat-resistant, stable industrial oil. That's what industry likes. It's stable, it doesn't degrade, it doesn't catch fire, it lubricates. That's a very useful industrial product. But because of those same properties, we find them to be a real problem when we get into the environment. They're not breaking down. We can't metabolize them. They get into food webs because they're in oil. They don't dissolve in water. They dissolve in fats. And they magnify up into our beloved killer whales, harbor seals, et cetera, et cetera. So with each one of these cases, science discovered that DDT and PCB, which were chemicals designed on purpose with defined applications, or dioxins that were never produced intentionally. They were a byproduct of processes, notably the bleaching of craft. but also some incomplete combustion. In all three of these cases, these represented major threats to wildlife, major threats to human health, and it was the environmental sciences that revealed and characterized the nature of these problems, and it has actually given regulators the ability to judge new chemicals a little bit better based on the common properties that these chemicals have. These three classes of chemicals are persistent, they biomagnify, and they're toxic. They're not acutely toxic unless you take an awful lot of them. They're endocrine disruptors. They're not going to cause a whale to wash up dead. They're going to make that whale a little bit weaker, make the immune system work a little bit less well. It might impair reproduction, decrease sperm count, or affect neurological development. They're slow-acting hormone mimics. Let's not confuse them with arsenic or something that's acutely toxic. They're slow-acting, and therein lies the real danger, because they may be affecting and shaping the evolution and the ongoing survival of many of these long-lived species. With marine mammals, for some reason, and I'll give you three guesses, or you can just think quietly about three possibilities. Why do marine mammals always get the shaft when it comes to humans and our activities? Why are marine mammals so vulnerable? Well, we've got lots of examples. We've got stellar sea cow that I believe has the distinction of being the animal with the shortest period of time from discovery to extinction. I believe it's 29 years from discovery by humans to extinction from this planet. We've got lots of examples in the North Pacific of animals that have that face tremendous threats. Lots on the Asian side with Yangtze River dolphin, the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin in parts of Asia, the Hawaiian monk seal, probably 1,000 left, and of course our killer whales here. They don't all face the same threats, but they're all vulnerable and have been made vulnerable by virtue of their habitat needs and some of their biological features. And to me, whether it's a harbor seal or a killer whale or a sea otter or a pink dolphin, all of these animals can serve as canaries, telling me something about what's going on in the ocean. And I'm guessing that every single person in this room would also look at whales and say, hey, our southern residents are in trouble. That's got to tell me that something's wrong in the ocean. But for me, trying to look at what they're telling me, we can start to discover something about different chemicals, different threats, and the nature of what those threats might be by looking at each of these different examples of different species and then tracking them down and trying to figure out what they're telling us. So the canary in the coal mine analogy in some ways is a good one. The canary warned miners that there was either methane or carbon monoxide that was reaching toxic levels in mine shafts, and when the canary died, the miners ran for safety or put masks on. The problem with this little analogy is that the canary died. Right. So if we're going to wait for killer whales to die as a result of very heavy releases of very persistent, long-lasting chemicals, I don't think we're really doing a service to our natural resource management or stewardship. Nonetheless, they can inform, and they have helped to, I think, improve regulations or support regulations. And as described by several speakers today, southern resident killer whales, transboundary species, they are a bit of an iconic indicator of what's going on in the Salish Sea. They are listed on both sides of the border. Both federal governments in Canada and the States have worked diligently, sometimes slowly and sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, but there have been some very good people on both sides of the border in federal agencies, state agencies, provincial agencies, certainly the conservation groups, stakeholders, galvanized by shared concerns about killer whales. And it's been a potent force. I mean, looking at the way in which news items around individual stranded killer whales or concerns about recent population trends, looking at how you can get certain parties to back down or get on the defensive is pretty astounding how powerful these killer whales and the messaging can be. That makes it a little bit dangerous. One has to always be a little bit cautious when one uses that messaging, but I would argue that if you are working responsibly and rationally towards recovering southern resident killer whales, you're going to do an awful lot to protecting the entire Salish Sea, because these animals are at the top of the food web. If you're protecting killer whales, you're going to have to, by default, protect many of the Chinook salmon runs and chum salmon runs. You're going to have to address the question of dealing with persistent bioaccumulative contaminants. You're going to have to look at acoustic impacts and disturbance and work with, for example, the whale watching sector to ensure that there's a good balance between observing and watching and learning. And of course, these animals are teaching our children and our friends from here and afar, and impacting the animals. So there's always a bit of a balance. We often we hear the term, we've got to be careful we don't love these animals to death. But I really have to give a lot of credit to a few pioneers that most of you will know, and that would be Mike Bake on the top right, John Ford, Graham Ellis, Ken Balcom. Ken, can you wave? Where are you? Ken, wave. Ken Balcom, there he is. We do have to thank Ken for lifelong commitment to these animals. And Lance Brett Leonard on the bottom. And these five gentlemen and many other key people that I have not named, without these people, I wouldn't have been able to do my studies on pollutants in these animals, because it was only by establishing the photo identification catalogs and starting to understand who was who, how old they were, who was related to who, are they eating fish or are they eating marine mammals, are they 8 years old or 88 years old. Only by understanding those biological features of individually recognized animals were we able to get biopsies from live animals, take those samples, measure the contaminants in them, and start to understand what those contaminant levels meant. So the photo ID catalog, a non-invasive scientific means of studying this population of animals, the best understood cetacean population in the world. So when you look around the room and you look at the science that has been done on this distinct population segment, this community of animals, remember that what you're also doing is you're seeing science that is really informing killer whale conservation worldwide. So this is a bit of a laboratory, a living laboratory for studying killer whales worldwide. So the persistent organic pollutants, I did want to talk a little bit more about them. They are persistent, they biomagnify, and they're toxic. They're often found at very high levels at the top of the food web because of these features, and we find them at very, very high concentrations in many marine mammals. With the killer whales, what we found 12 years ago now, was that the southern residents and the transients were the most PCB contaminated marine mammals in the world, surpassing the belugas in the St. Lawrence that had long been the poster child of the industrialized Great Lakes area, surpassing the PCB levels in those belugas by 3 to 5 times. When we first published this, I started getting phone calls from my colleagues back east working in Quebec on the belugas, and from people in Ottawa and people in Washington, D.C. saying, you must have made a mistake. You must be off by a factor of 1,000 with your calculations. You must have done some mistake with your units. No. No, very, very high levels. In fact, if you compare these levels in transients, blue in the male for males and pink for the females, the average male transient killer whale is about 500 times more PCB contaminated than anybody in this room. And that's if you take a gram of fat out of anybody here and compare it to a gram of fat in a transient killer whale, they're 500 times more contaminated than you or I. So when we worry about human health effects associated with PCBs, and believe me, there are thousands of studies showing that PCBs are affecting people, different populations, different cohorts, occupationally exposed or heavy fish eaters or worked in industry or whatever. You got to say, well, if we're worried about PCBs and human health, what about these transient killer whales or the southern residents? The southern residents 150 times more contaminated than we are, the average male. Everyone knows why females have lower concentrations than males. Lactation, yes. What is the milk? What is the fat content of killer whale milk? Anybody guess? High. Hi. Yes. Do people like French cheeses in this? It's about the same fat content as a good camembert. So about 35 to 40% fat content in killer whale milk. That's fantastic for the calf who's nursing for maybe a year and a half, maybe 2. It's great. Nutrients, energy, they need that. They need the blubber for insulation, mobility, buoyancy, energy. But with that energy and the nutrients that come with that energy and the fat, you get the chemicals. So the females are actually cleaning themselves out. And lo and behold, the guys end up just being dirty old men. Sorry. We want them to become old, of course. A recent work that we did in our laboratory, Andrew Buckman led this study looking at genomics, and these are the hormone receptors or the endocrine receptors in tissues. So these are from biopsies of killer whales, live killer whales, northern resident and transients, no southern residents here. We found that PCBs are causing a dose response in the expression in a number of genes, including in the middle top is TR-alpha, that's thyroid receptor. That is the receptor that governs our whole thyroid hormone system, which of course is key for energy use, metabolism, growth. Top right, dose response, increase in the expression caused by PCBs of the estrogen receptor. Everyone knows what estrogen is, very important female hormone. So we have evidence now that current levels of PCBs are leading to physiological changes in these killer whales. We don't know if that means they reproduce less or more, or they use more energy, or they have trouble with growth and development. But this is physiological evidence, very carefully controlled circumstances, that PCBs are causing adverse effects in these animals. So if that's the case, and we want to do something about it, how do we respond? How do our managers respond? Because someone like me, I come along, I do science, I uncover all this bad news. Of course, I'm a government scientist, my managers go, no, more bad news. They've got enough stuff on their desk, they're overworked, are they overpaid or underpaid down here? Anyway, government managers usually don't want bad news, and they don't want more work. So how do we give them advice that will allow them to actually tackle this or do something and have a positive news story at the end of the day? Or if conservation groups or stakeholders, people that are helping to participate in recovery planning or conservation planning, how do they take this information and go forward? So I would argue that what we have to do is try to figure out, one of the main things we have to figure out is what are the priority chemicals of concern in these animals or their prey, and where are they coming from? Because where they are coming from is key to mitigation and source control and regulations and all the rest. And this is very difficult when it comes to killer whales because they're feeding on salmon that migrates around the North Pacific. They're moving from California to central British Columbia occasionally. They're in the inland waters here, frequenting the islands here in May through October, and then they disappear, and sometimes they might be down in California, sometimes they're offshore, sometimes they're back here again. So very hard to study killer whales and understand where they might be getting exposed to contaminants. But when we look at the Salish Sea, what do we find? Everyone, no surprise here, we've got a lot of land use, we've got a lot of pulp mills, we've got a lot of agriculture, we've got a lot of urban development. We have 7 or 8 million people, 8 million people, 100 whales. Guess what? 100,000 people for every whale. I think, I say that now, and I've been saying that for 10 or 15 years, but it continues to astound me when I hear myself say that. 100,000 people per killer whale. Think of that the next time you flush the toilet, or clean the sink, or go to the car wash. Or there's a heavy storm and it's dry and there's a lot of ash and dust and copper and asbestos and oil on the road. Then we get into the stormwater and the combined sewage outfalls and all of that, the non-point source pollution. Pretty difficult. So we've got a few challenges, but we do have a backyard that we value and is worth money and is still pretty healthy. So I think everyone here wants to see that diversity and health and economic prosperity around here continue. So what can we look at? And I would say the harbor seals tell me just a little bit more about source, transport, fate of priority chemicals. I've got two chemicals here from harbor seals live captured on both sides of the border, South Puget Sound, Victoria area, Vancouver, and northern Strait of Georgia. PCBs in red on the left. Those were the ones we banned in Canada, the States in the mid-1970s, but they're notoriously persistent. They're what I would call the #1 threat to killer whales from a contaminant perspective. But they're what we call a legacy chemical. They've been declining since the mid-1970s. In fact, we've modeled that they've declined 2.5 to 4 times in southern resident killer whales over the last 40 to 50 years, okay? PCBs, #1 threat, they're down 2.5 to 4 times since we banned them in killer whales, okay? That's a good news story. That's where I say we uncovered some bad news. The regulators said, we'll ban PCBs. Industry grumbled, saying that's going to cost us all this money. But the end game, which we couldn't have predicted back then because nobody was studying contaminants in killer whales, but the end game is that was a good news story all around because it meant the entire food web today is cleaner and killer whales aren't extinct. I don't know what would have happened if we didn't ban PCBs in the mid-1970s, to be quite honest. PBDEs on the right. How many people have heard of PBDEs? That's good. I know, very topical here in Washington State because the Washington State legislature didn't want to wait for your federal government to ban this very nasty class of chemicals. Did you know that PBDEs are virtually identical to PCBs? And that we banned PCBs in the mid-1970s? PBDEs were grandfathered in, both in Canada and the States, before the new chemical regulations in the late 1980s in both countries. Grandfathered in meant you couldn't ban them unless you had evidence of serious human or environmental harm. You had to have evidence of that before you banned them. So PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, structurally very similar to PCBs. They're just brominated instead of chlorinated. And what we've been finding in harbor seals is they've been doubling in concentration every 3 years from a long-term study we've been doing down in southern Puget Sound with Steve Jeffries and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. But here what you see is an overview of what's happening over space, and you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, on the left, PCBs much higher, but 7 times higher in southern Puget Sound compared to Juan de Fuca Strait or the Strait of Georgia. And that's due to 2 things. Number 1 is heavy use and history of spills of PCBs in Puget Sound, both industry and military. But number 2, and this is where you have to we have to look at the environment to tell us something. Puget Sound is a much more vulnerable receiving environment than is the Strait of Georgia. And I say that because you can see the plume of silt coming out of the Fraser Valley, right near Vancouver, if everyone knows where Vancouver is. You see that plume, that's glacial till that is essentially releasing fine particles, burying, creating a very high sedimentation rate, which is burying old chemicals in the sediments. Because the best thing we can hope for these persistent compounds is these chemicals get buried over time. Because they have a half-life of hundreds of years. So we want these chemicals to be buried. So Strait of Georgia, they do get buried more naturally than Puget Sound, where there's less freshwater input, less natural sedimentation, hence less burial. This is important when you're looking at permitting of discharges or regulations or source control. It's important to understand what you're releasing into and whether it's a vulnerable body for the receipt of effluent or chemicals. For the PBDEs on the right, we notice that, again, South Puget Sound, the harbor seals are more contaminated than some of their counterparts further north, but you'll see that the difference is less. These chemicals are more ubiquitous in the Salish Sea, in harbor seals, and the food web upon which harbor seals sit. And I would ascribe this to the fact that they're basically still in use. these chemicals are still in use, getting out of all of our municipal effluent. That's a primary means by which these chemicals get out into the water. So current use chemical. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. But you'll see here that what we've got is harbor seals revealing something about source transport of these chemicals and where they would be entering the food web. And if you were a killer whale swimming around the Salish Sea, and you decided to eat some herring, which is much of the herring is regional. It doesn't migrate great distances. Would you rather have herring from down at Gertrude Island in South Puget Sound, or up in Juan-de-Fuca Strait or Strait of Georgia? So we start to look at the entire food web. You'll simply realize that food web in southern Puget Sound more contaminated, and hence if you're a killer whale, a resident killer whale, and you decide to eat fish, chowing down near McNeil Island or Gertrude Island or King County, probably not a terrific idea. And if you're a manager or a stakeholder, you may be interested in these results because you want to find out whether CSOs or stormwater overflow or contaminated sites or historical military activity areas are introducing contaminants into the area. And there's a lot of work on Superfund sites, a lot of engineering and remediation. There is a lot of monitoring done by NOAA, EPA, Washington Department of Ecology, and Fish and Wildlife. So a lot of this information is getting back, and a lot of it is getting acted on, and there's lots of good news there. So that's sort of the regional, local story, but there's another story here, and that's the global story, because when you talk about killer whales, and you talk about Chinook salmon, you're talking about the North Pacific. This is carbon monoxide sort of rendition or cartoon of releases from Asia on the left, and how they travel across, how these clouds, these emissions travel across the North Pacific to North America. It's a little bit vague. You'll see the outline of the Pacific Rim there. Do you know how long it takes for an air mass to get from China to our coastline? Any guesses? Shout it out.
2 days.
3 days, 2 weeks. Very good. Yeah, it's 5 to 10 days. It doesn't take a long time. And some of you probably remember the Gobi dust storm of, I think it was 1996 or 98, or there was, did anybody have to wash their car here from after that dust storm from the Gobi Desert? Anybody remember that? No? Anyway, the point is that anything that's released in China with the emerging economy that they have, the powerhouse economy, is releasing all sorts of contaminants, from mercury to pesticides to PBDEs to PCBs, DDT, and they're being emitted from Asia, and they're either traveling across and getting caught in the Cascades, the Olympics, the Rockies. On the western slope, we find higher concentrations of these contaminants on the western slopes of these mountain ranges than on the eastern slopes. And we also find these chemicals dropping out in the North Pacific, where they're then forced into the food web, and lo and behold, guess who's coming home to dinner? Salmon. We and Sandy O'Neill and others showed that Chinook salmon, that up to 99% of their body burden of pesticides, chlorinated pesticides and PCBs, is coming from their time outside of their natal stream. So that'd be time in on the shelf and in the North Pacific. Up to 99% of their body burden of contaminants that they're bringing back into their natal stream at maturity is coming from their time at sea. So that is showing us that the Chinook are actually out there grazing. They're not getting really super contaminated, but they are picking up these contaminants. And the longer-lived individuals, and in fact, the higher trophic level individuals, because Chinook are the highest trophic level out of the salmonids, have the highest levels of these persistent contaminants, because that's what you see with this biomagnification process. I had a graduate student, Jenny Christensen. She decided to look at grizzly bears that ate salmon. And she was able to look at tissue samples from grizzly bears and what they ate and scat, and she did a study, and she estimated that 70% of the organic chlorine pesticides, 90% of the PCBs, and 85% of the lighter PBDEs were coming from salmon. So as grizzly bears benefit to a tremendous degree by the nutrient-rich salmon, are getting exposed to these chemicals And this is up in the central coast area of British Columbia. The population density, industrial activity is fairly low. You can be pretty sure that a lot of these are from the open Pacific Ocean. So I'll try to flip this around, and because I'm starting to spoil your dinner, I think, Howard. I've seen some glum faces out there. There's always lots of bad news out there, but there are things that we can do. And in fact, people in Washington State have long espoused the whale-friendly lawn campaign. Some people have salmon-friendly lawns. Current use pesticide is something that we should be a little bit concerned about, because a lot of the currently used pesticides that we allow on the market are ones that are not persistent and don't biomagnify. Because we learned about DDT, you don't want persistent biomagnifying pesticides on the market. So industry turned around and said, okay, we'll make pesticides that are non-persistent, they're going to break down into something else. We don't know what else, but they're going to break down into something else. And they're not going to biomagnify. What does that mean? That means they're going to be dissolved in water. And they're going to travel through water, because they don't dissolve in fat, they dissolve in water. So that becomes a problem when it comes to salmon. And there's certainly a lot of concern about the impacts of current use pesticides, whether it's by the forestry sector, agriculture sector, or the cosmetic household use of these pesticides. And this is something that individual consumers and conservation groups can do, because to me, critical habitat for killer whales is not out there in Puget Sound or in the San Juans or in the Strait of Georgia. It's where the salmon is produced. That's what the killer whales need. They need the salmon. They don't need the space around them so much as the delivery of safe and abundant salmon. So to me, critical habitat by extension are those salmon-producing, salmon-bearing streams, and they need some habitat protection. I mentioned that pulp mill regulations in the late 1980s in both countries helped to reduce the release of dioxins and furans and helped to cause a decline in the tissue concentrations of these very nasty chemicals in Dungeness crab, which is a favorite for many of us. So that's a good news story. Dioxin, the most toxic chemical man has ever produced. Nasty, nasty stuff. Good news for the PCBs. They've been dropping steadily in harbor seals in Gertrude Sound. So, Gertrude Island, south of Puget Sound. We've seen a decline in concentrations in harbor seals of up to 8 to 10 times since the mid-1970s. That's good news. We have to congratulate industry and the government managers that helped to produce this scenario, because that is a good news story. It's not great. It was a mistake to have these chemicals on the market. It was a mistake to have them released into the environment, and we continue to pay for that, and killer whales will continue to be exposed to very high levels for quite some time, but nonetheless, regulations did help. PBDEs, the flame retardants, they were doubling every 3 years until 2004. Again, South Puget